100,000 years ago, Earth wasn't home to just one kind of human. Several human species lived side by side, some similar to us, others strikingly different. But when these groups met, it wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes they shared genes, and other times they shared violence. Evidence suggests that one of the earliest wars in history wasn't fought between nations or tribes, but between entirely different human species, and in the end, only one survived: Homo sapiens, us, 100,000 years ago. Earth was not the domain of a single kind of human. Instead, it was home to several human species, each shaped by its environment and each carving out its own way of life. We often imagine the past as a story of our species slowly spreading across the globe. But in truth, the world of our ancestors was far more complex and crowded. Across Europe, Asia, and even remote islands, different kinds of humans thrived side by side. The Neanderthals of Ice Age Europe, short, stocky, and immensely strong, mastered survival in cold climates, creating tools, building shelters, and even burying their dead with flowers in gestures that suggest symbolic thought. Farther east, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, lived the Denisovans, a people we know mostly from a handful of bone fragments, but whose DNA still lives inside many of us today, influencing everything from our immune systems to our ability to thrive at high altitudes. Journey to Southeast Asia and you would find the tiny Homo floresiensis, nicknamed hobbits, barely 3 feet tall but capable hunters who crafted stone tools and brought down dwarf elephants. For millions of years, multiple human species coexisted on Earth, much like chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas share Africa today. What is truly unusual is not that many humans once lived together, but that now, in our present age, only one remains. The evidence for this lost diversity is written in stone, bone, and DNA. In Siberia's Denisova cave, scientists uncovered a small finger bone that did not belong to either modern humans or Neanderthals, but to a completely different species, the Denisovans. Later, in the same cave, a fragment of bone from a teenage girl revealed something extraordinary. Her mother was a Neanderthal, her father a Denisovan. Nicknamed Denny, she stands as direct proof that these species not only lived alongside each other, but formed families together. Genetic studies show that if your ancestry is European or Asian, around 2% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. And if your lineage traces to Papua New Guinea or Australia, as much as 5% may come from Denisovans. Even some African populations carry traces of encounters with other, still unidentified human groups. In a sense, every one of us alive today is a hybrid, carrying biological souvenirs from ancient encounters. But these meetings were not always peaceful. Alongside evidence of interbreeding, we also find signs of violence: fractured skulls, punctured ribs, and bones that tell stories of brutal conflict. When these species met, they did not only exchange genes, they also fought, raided, and perhaps killed one another in struggles over land, resources, and survival. This was not war as we know it today. There were no armies, no written strategies, no maps to conquer, but it was something hauntingly familiar. Border skirmishes, raids, and deadly clashes repeated countless times over tens of thousands of years. Humanity's first war, in a sense, was not between different tribes of Homo sapiens, but between entirely different species of humans, each adapted for a different survival strategy, each vying for the same shrinking spaces on a harsh ice age planet. And when this long drawn-out conflict finally ended, only one kind of human remained: Homo sapiens, the last survivors, the hybrids, the inheritors of every struggle, every exchange, every loss, and every fragile victory written in the bones of our ancestors. 50,000 years ago, the Earth was not inhabited by just one human species, but by several, spread across continents and environments, each with its own unique adaptations, cultures, and survival strategies. If you could have traveled on foot from what is now Spain to the Caucasus Mountains, you wouldn't have met only Homo sapiens. You would have encountered Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps even other, smaller branches of the human family tree. Along the Mediterranean coast, Neanderthals occupied caves where they crafted advanced tools, painted walls with symbolic imagery, and buried their dead in ways that reveal an emotional and cultural depth once thought exclusive to modern humans. To the east, in the cold reaches of Siberia and the rugged Alai Mountains, the mysterious Denisovans lived, an elusive species known mostly from fragments of bone and, more importantly, the genetic signatures they left behind in us. Their DNA survives in many populations today, quietly shaping aspects of our biology. From immune responses to the ability of certain groups to survive at high altitudes. Farther south, scattered across the Indonesian islands, lived Homo floresiensis. The so-called hobbits, tiny humans standing only about 3 feet tall, yet fully capable of crafting stone tools and hunting dwarf elephants. An extraordinary reminder that intelligence and survival were not defined by body size alone. What seems bizarre to us now, that multiple kinds of humans once walked the earth together, was, in fact, the norm. For millions of years, the planet was shared by several human species at once, just as today, Africa is shared by chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. The unusual thing is not that the Ice Age world was full of human diversity, but that today, for the first time in history, we live in a world with only one surviving species, us. The evidence for this vanished diversity is overwhelming. Archaeological sites across Europe, Asia, and Africa reveal different tool-making traditions, burial practices, and cultural signatures that can be tied to different species. The genetic record is even clearer. The discovery in Denisova cave in 2010 of a tiny finger bone belonging to neither a Neanderthal nor a modern human changed everything, proving the existence of a completely different human species. 8 years later, another fragment from the same cave was tested, and the results shocked researchers. The bone belonged to a teenage girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. This hybrid individual, nicknamed Denny, is hard evidence that these human groups not only coexisted, but intermingled, formed relationships, and even raised children together. Modern humans today still carry the legacy of these encounters. If your ancestry is European or Asian, roughly 2% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals, while people from Papua New Guinea and Australia carry up to 5% Denisova DNA. In fact, some African populations bear traces of DNA from other unknown human groups that science has not yet identified. These findings reveal that the story of humanity is not one of pure bloodlines, but of mixing, of connections across species boundaries, of hybridization that made us who we are. We are the product of countless ancient family reunions. Yet this picture, as fascinating as it is not the whole story. While there is undeniable evidence of interbreeding, there is also evidence of conflict. When these different species encountered one another, cooperation was not guaranteed. The archaeological record shows broken bones, injuries consistent with violence, and signs of competition for the same habitats and resources. For tens of thousands of years, valleys, forests, and river basins across Europe and Asia were not empty landscapes waiting for Homo sapiens to arrive, but contested ground, where Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans fought for survival. This long coexistence was marked by a strange duality. Sometimes intimacy, sometimes hostility, sometimes integration, and sometimes elimination. It was in this crowded, competitive world of many humans that our story began to take its decisive turn, as one species slowly but relentlessly pushed forward, adapting, expanding, and eventually emerging as the last humankind left standing. To grasp why clashes between different human species may have turned violent, we first need to recognize how profoundly they differed, not just in culture, but in their bodies, their metabolisms, and their strategies for survival. Neanderthals, who had spent more than 300,000 years adapting to Ice Age Europe, were the ultimate cold-weather humans. Built like natural powerlifters with wide rib cages, short limbs, and stocky frames that conserved heat and supported tremendous muscle mass, their skeletons were denser and their bodies carried more raw strength than ours. Biomechanical studies suggest they were roughly 30% stronger pound-for-pound than modern humans. This strength wasn't for show, was born of necessity. Neanderthal hunting strategies involved stalking massive animals such as bison, wild horses, and sometimes even woolly rhinoceroses, and then attacking them at incredibly close range with heavy thrusting spears. This method was effective, but also brutal and dangerous. The evidence lies written in their bones: fractured skulls, crushed ribs, torn ligaments, and healed injuries that resemble those of modern rodeo riders and bullfighters. Their lives were physically demanding and often violent, not just in conflict with other humans, but in their everyday struggle against the Ice Age megafauna that shared their lands. Homo sapiens, by contrast, evolved under very different conditions in Africa. Instead of power, we specialized in endurance. Our lighter skeletons, longer limbs, and narrower hips made us far less robust in hand-to-hand struggles. But they gave us an unmatched ability to travel long distances and regulate heat while running. We became persistence hunters, able to track and chase prey for hours until it collapsed from exhaustion. But even more significant than our physiology was our technology. While Neanderthals relied on thrusting weapons, Homo sapiens had mastered the art of the projectile. By around 300,000 years ago, African sites show that our ancestors were crafting spears, and not long after, attaching stone tips to wooden shafts, creating some of the first composite weapons in history. More importantly, we didn't just stab. With these tools, we threw them. A thrown spear transformed the rules of hunting and fighting alike. It meant prey could be killed from 20 or 30 meters away rather than at grappling distance, dramatically reducing the risk of injury. It also meant that physical strength was no longer the only deciding factor. A lighter, weaker human, armed with a well-made javelin, could kill an animal or a rival without ever coming within arm's reach. Archaeological evidence from Germany has revealed exquisitely crafted wooden javelins dating back 300,000 years. Carved from specific woods, carefully balanced, and weighted like modern Olympic throwing spears. When modern athletes tested replicas of these weapons, they were able to hit targets with deadly accuracy at ranges exceeding 20 meters, proving that this technology gave our ancestors a decisive edge. Yet technology was not the only factor. Metabolism mattered just as much. Neanderthals, with their massive frames and cold weather adaptations, needed staggering amounts of energy. Physiologists estimate between 3,500 and 4,000 calories per day for an adult male, nearly twice the requirement of a Homo sapiens. In good times, when game was plentiful, this wasn't an issue. But in lean times, that enormous caloric demand became a dangerous liability. By contrast, our lighter bodies and more efficient energy use allowed us to survive on less food, to travel farther with fewer resources, and to sustain larger groups on the same amount of land. In the harsh arithmetic of survival, efficiency often outweighed strength. When Neanderthals and Homo sapiens finally came face to face, it was a clash of radically different survival strategies. Close combat specialists versus long-range hunters, calorie-burning giants versus efficient marathoners. The archaeological record suggests that these encounters were not always peaceful. Evidence like the punctured rib of a Neanderthal in Shanidar Cave, likely caused by a thrown spear, hints that our technological edge may have tipped the balance. In violent encounters, it was not just brains versus brawn, but two entirely different visions of what it meant to be human colliding on the same landscape. When Homo sapiens first began moving into Europe around 45,000 years ago, they were not stepping into an empty wilderness, but into a land already claimed by another species, Neanderthals, who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years, and who understood its harsh climates, dangerous animals, and complex landscapes better than anyone. This was not an abandoned stage awaiting newcomers. It was already occupied by skilled, intelligent, and formidable humans who had mastered survival in Ice Age Europe long before we appeared. Archaeological evidence shows that the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe was not a swift conquest, but a long, drawn-out struggle, a contest of endurance and strategy that lasted thousands of years. Neanderthals were not passive victims. They resisted. They held their ground in caves and valleys. They defended their territories, and they adapted their strategies as new rivals arrived on their doorstep. For a long time, they succeeded. Tools found at Neanderthal sites reveal sophisticated craftsmanship, including stone points, scrapers, and even evidence of hafting detaching stone blades to wooden handles with adhesive, an innovation once thought unique to us. Neanderthals also used fire skillfully, built shelters, and hunted cooperatively, proving that they were not primitive brutes but complex humans with intelligence rivaling our own. Burial sites such as Shanidar Cave in Iraq even show that they cared for their sick and injured, keeping individuals with crippling injuries alive for years, a sign of deep social bonds and compassion. These were not people easily displaced. Yet the arrival of Homo sapiens brought something new, a species that could think and cooperate on a scale that Neanderthals had never encountered. Our weapon spears designed for throwing, later aided by otlots, and eventually bows gave us range. Our ability to create symbolic art, to imagine, and to tell stories allowed us to form larger, more tightly bound groups, united by shared beliefs and identities. In a fight between individuals, a Neanderthal may well have overpowered a Homo sapiens, but survival was not decided in duels, it was decided in collective strategies, in who could organize hunts more efficiently, defend territory more effectively, and recover more quickly after losses. Still, Neanderthals did not vanish overnight. Genetic and archaeological evidence shows they persisted for thousands of years after our arrival, fighting, interbreeding, and adapting. In fact, some of the earliest Homo sapiens in Europe seem to have adopted elements of Neanderthal toolmaking, suggesting that knowledge flowed both ways, a cultural exchange as much as a rivalry. There were alliances as well as conflicts, families, as well as wars, and for a time, the balance remained uncertain, but gradually, the tide began to turn. As climates shifted, and resources became scarcer, the higher caloric needs of Neanderthals may have worked against them, while Homo sapiens' efficiency, long-distance trade networks, and broader diets gave us an advantage. Slowly but steadily, Neanderthal populations dwindled, their strongholds shrinking to isolated pockets in southern Spain, Gibraltar, and a few mountain valleys. By around 40,000 years ago, most of them were gone, leaving behind only scattered fossils and fragments of DNA carried inside us. Yet to frame their story as a tragic defeat would be to misunderstand it. For thousands of years after our arrival, Neanderthals resisted us. They fought, they adapted, and they survived in the face of a relentless competitor. Their legacy is not only in the bones we dig from caves, but in our own genomes, in the genes that help us resist disease or cope with colder climates, inherited directly from them. In that sense, the Neanderthals were not erased. They endure as a part of us, a reminder that the first great war of humanity was not only about extinction, but also about fusion. Not only about conquest, but also about survival through connection. The story of the Neanderthal resistance is not the story of their end, it is the story of how, even in their last struggle, they shaped the humans who would inherit the earth. If you step into the caves of Ice Age Europe, you step into the shadows of another world, one where the walls themselves seem to breathe with memory, holding the secrets of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens who once sought refuge there. These caves were more than shelters. They were theaters of survival, arenas of ritual, and in many cases, silent witnesses to encounters sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent between different kinds of humans. Archaeological discoveries reveal a haunting picture: bones gnawed by both animals and humans, tools discarded in haste, hearths layered one on top of another, suggesting generations of occupation and reoccupation as groups competed for the same life-giving spaces. In some caves, such as El Sideroa Un in Spain, the remains of Neanderthals show clear evidence of violence. Their bones fractured and cut marked in ways that suggest not only combat, but possibly cannibalism, raising questions about whether this was driven by desperation in times of famine or by conflict with rival groups. In Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthals left behind burials sprinkled with pollen, long interpreted as evidence of symbolic behavior and care for the dead, proof that these humans had inner lives as rich and emotional as ours. Yet, by the time Homo sapiens began leaving their marks on cave walls, a different kind of expression emerged. Art. The caves of Chauvet-Lascaux and Altamira, painted more than 30,000 years ago, are filled with images of mammoths, lions, bison, and horses, rendered with stunning precision, perspective, and even a sense of motion. These paintings are not mere decorations. They are evidence of imagination, of storytelling, of the ability to create shared myths that bound communities together. While Neanderthals left behind symbolic objects, pigment-stained shells, eagle talon ornaments, and perhaps even abstract carvings, nothing quite matches the explosion of representational art that appeared with our species. In those flickering shadows, under the glow of firelight, Homo sapiens began to shape not just tools but meaning, creating worlds that existed in the mind as much as in the physical landscape. This symbolic leap was not trivial. It may have been the decisive advantage that tipped the balance in our favor. Shared myths and symbols allowed larger groups of Homo sapiens to cooperate, to trust strangers bound by belief rather than blood, to plan coordinated hunts or wage wars with a unity that no other human species could match. The cave, then, becomes both a refuge and a mirror, reflecting the deep contrasts between us and the Neanderthals. For them, survival was about enduring the cold, mastering the hunt, and holding on to scarce resources with fierce resilience. For us, survival was increasingly about imagination, about projecting ourselves into the past and future, about painting animals not just to record them, but perhaps to summon their spirits, to weave rituals that bound us as one. The shadows in the cave hold both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, because they reveal the birth of culture as we understand it today. And tragedy, because they also mark the twilight of Neanderthals. As our art spread across Europe, their presence began to fade, retreating into the margins of history. Yet, even in their fading, the caves preserve their whispers. Footprints of children left in soft mud alongside ours, stone tools mixed with our own, and the lingering evidence of encounters that were not simply wars of extinction, but moments of shared humanity. In these dark chambers, we glimpse both the rivalry and the kinship that defined our earliest chapters. The caves remind us that while Homo sapiens would eventually inherit the earth, we did not walk into that inheritance alone. We carried with us the echoes of others, their shadows etched into stone, and ultimately, into our very blood. The story of early humanity is not just about survival, but about competition, adaptation, and connection. Neanderthals did not simply vanish, they resisted, influenced, and even became a part of us. In their legacy, written in both caves and our DNA, we find that the first great human war was never just about conquest, but about becoming who we are.